Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel and for the third installment of my SkyBurger Devlog series. In this video, we'll be going over some of the updates that I've been able to make since my last video, and show off some of the new features that I was able to work into the game as well. Now, it's been a while since I've released any update on the game. In fact, it's been over a year since I released the last devlog, but this isn't because I wasn't working on the game or anything. I've been working on the game the entire time, but due to some unfortunate circumstances I've been having with my family life, I didn't really have time to work on the game and provide updated devlog videos like I had wanted to. I actually had this video script typed out right after posting my last devlog, so I apologize for not keeping up on this. So without any further hesitation, let's get right into it. Okay guys, so the last video was really focused on a lot of user interface and player menu type material. So this time, I figured I'd focus a little more on actual gameplay functionality. I figured the best place to start would be with the actual creation of a money system widget for the player. I mean, the game is about selling sandwiches to customers, so it only makes sense to implement this gameplay mechanic next. I began by making a widget that would house a money icon and a text variable that would be able to represent the amount of money that the player currently has. This would be affected by the customer NPCs and by a food spawner mechanic that I have planned for implementation, which will allow the player to pay money to receive more ingredients that they will use to serve to more customers, thus completing the gameplay loop for the free play level. I want the free play level to essentially be a continuous loop. Basically, the loop being take orders, make burgers, obtain money, buy ingredients, and repeat. So this mechanic was pretty essential for the game overall. I basically added an image texture and a text to a widget blueprint that would dynamically change based off of an integer value contained within the player character blueprint. The player character would create the widget and add it to the player's viewport, which is then stored within the player character for later use. Once I had gotten the widget to respond to the variable within the player character's blueprint, I started adding a border around the text and an image to try and make it a little more visible to the player. I ended up going through a few different variations of this, and I'm pretty sure that what I have now won't be the final result, but as I said, I spent a lot of time in the last video with user interface implementation, so I'm just going to leave this widget as it is. Now that I had the widget responding to the player character's money variable, I needed to have a way for the variable to be affected by the customer NPCs when the player delivers an order to the customer. I have it set so that once the player delivers food to a customer, the customer NPC will then test the order to see if it matches to a set of variables that I've set within the customer NPC's blueprints. The amount of money that the player receives is determined by the order variable within the customer NPC, which then casts to the player character's money variable and then adds itself to the player character's existing money. Once this happens, the player character will then send an event to the player's money widget, which updates the text variable and completes the process. So after I'd gotten the money widget figured out, I wanted to start making a way for the player to be able to somehow get more ingredients. I decided to go for a computer looking machine that would house buttons that the player character could see and interact with. I made the buttons separate from the rest of the computer, that way it would be easier for me to implement within Unreal Engine. Once the basic shape of the computer had been created, I began working on the UVs of the meshes. For this, I moved over to Photoshop to make some of the images that would be represented on the buttons of the computer. Because I had 8 buttons in the front of the computer, I would need to create 8 different images to represent each button and what the player would purchase when interacting with the computer. Now that I had the images I needed to represent what the buttons would be spawning when interacted with, I moved over to Blender to implement them onto the mesh of the buttons. I began by smart unwrapping the button's UVs and assigning 2 different material slots. One that would be for the basic color of the button, and the other which would be for the image of the item that the button will spawn when interacted with by the player. I played around with some of the material settings and finally got the mesh looking decent, at least for what I needed. After getting the UVs and materials for the computer mesh set up, I exported the mesh out of Blender and over to Unreal Engine for implementation. Once I had the mesh in Unreal Engine, I made a simple actor blueprint that would be the computer model in the game that the character would interact with. I then began working on texturing the mesh. Because of the way that I set up the UVs, I was able to utilize the main material that I had already created to the texture to the main material slots of the meshes that I set up in Blender. I would, however, have to create a material for the face of the buttons to hold the image of the items that they would spawn. But this was an easy task as I've done quite a bit of material making within Unreal Engine at this point. I brought the images I created in Photoshop into Unreal Engine and began making materials out of these images. I made a basic material with variables that I could utilize in material instances, and this way I wouldn't have to create a new base material for all 8 images for the buttons. Now that I had materials of the images, all that I would have to do now is plug them into the correct material slots on the button meshes. Now that I had the spawner looking decent in Unreal Engine, it was time for me to begin working on the game mechanics of the mesh. To begin, I wanted to have an interaction widget appear on the screen to indicate to the player that the button was an interactable item. I added collision meshes to the buttons and branched off of my interact widget that I had already created for the register. I gave each button a specified tag that the player's interact trace would look for when colliding with a mesh. If the mesh has one of these tags, the corresponding message would appear for that specific button. This includes the item's name, the price of the item, the quantity of the items being ordered, and the button press directive to interact with the button and order the object. Once I had one of the buttons working the way that I needed it to, I could pretty much copy and paste the rest of the nodes and adjust their messages according to the tag that the button possessed within the computer's blueprint. I decided on the prices within the computers based on the price that the burgers would be sold at. I tried to make it so that the profit margin with each burger successfully sold is about 30% of the cost to make the burger. I figured this would be a good profit margin for the player for now. I will more than likely tweak these numbers a bit after having some playtesting done to see how well that works in the game. So now that the buttons showed the interactable widget to the player when looking at them, I had to develop the mechanic that would allow the buttons to spawn food when interacted with. I started by creating an actor blueprint that the items could spawn from. I set up a function that would test the player's money integer versus the cost of the item that the button represented. When the player character interacts with the button mesh, it will communicate to the item spawner and check to see if the player's money variable is equal to or greater than the specified integer to purchase the item. Once the items were successfully testing the player's money variable and spawning the items at the spawn location, I began working on having the player's money decrease when interacting with the buttons. This was achieved by simply having the player's money decrease whenever the check on an interacted button was successful. If the player's money is greater than or equal to the variable's cost, then the item would spawn at the spawner's location and decrease the player's money variable by the corresponding button that was interacted with. Just like with the interact widgets code, once I had one of the buttons set up, I could very easily copy and paste the majority of the nodes for the rest of the spawning mechanics. This would save me a lot of time as I would only have to go through and change certain variables to represent the correct function for checking and decreasing the player's money to spawn the items. I decided to have a spawner spawn 3 items for 1 purchase. This could very well change depending on any type of gameplay that I get from playtesting. I have ideas about making a mechanic that would allow the player to change the amount of items ordered when ordering the items, but I haven't really sat down and planned anything concrete for this yet. To have the spawner spawn 3 items, I had to copy and paste the spawning mechanic code 3 times after the function to have 3 items spawn when the interaction was successful. And again, once I had one of the functions completed, I could easily just copy and paste the majority of the code for the items. Getting the computer and food spawner to work while also checking and reducing the player's money variable was an extreme accomplishment for me. I felt confident in this mechanic and I didn't have a lot of troubles in creating it. I figured that the next logical thing to do for the spawning mechanic would be to create a vent for the food to spawn out of, instead of a just white floating cube. So for this, I moved back over to Blender to begin modeling out what I thought would be a good vent for it to be spawning from. Since the food tray was the biggest item that would spawn for the spawner, I decided it would be the best mesh to use for scaling. I began with a simple cube and got to work manipulating and morphing it into something that I thought looked decent enough. I wanted to make something that looked like food was just dropping out of it onto the counter from the ceiling. The mesh would sit over top of the item spawner and appear as if the items were just spawning from the vent. I feel like this helps with the setting of the game and makes it seem like food is just kind of being delivered to the player with a push of a button. After getting the mesh set up, I moved on to UV editing. I really feel that my skills with Blender and even Photoshop, for that fact, are really improving due to the amount of time that I've had to spend making all of the assets for this game from scratch. Normally doing meshes, UVs, and materials would take me a pretty decent amount of time, but I honestly was able to achieve this in about 2 hours of work. I spent most of my time deciding what colors to utilize off of my color palette, as I just wanted to use the main material that I created with Unreal Engine just as I had with all of the other meshes. I came up with a couple of different variations for this and chose one that I thought was the best for what I needed. Having finished the item spawning vent, I was inspired to try and create some basic vent shafts that I could put into the restaurant to help make it feel a little less empty. I started with a basic cube and added cuts that I scaled up to create the edges of the vent. I then added diagonal cuts to the main faces of the mesh and pulled the middle vertex point out to give the mesh a sense of depth. Once done, I was able to utilize Blender's array function to have the mesh repeat itself 3 times on the x-axis. Applying this array would solidify the array and add the geometry of the repeating meshes into the parent mesh, allowing for individualized manipulation of each section. I planned to make 3 different variations of these vents that I could snap together once I got them into the game engine. So I really had to sit and plan the meshes out methodically so that I could have these vents match with each other perfectly. After getting these modeled out, I imported the new meshes into Unreal Engine and began placing them throughout the restaurant. I really think that they help give the level a little bit more detail, so much so that I decided I wanted to try and model some ventilation fans as well. So after placing a few ventilation shafts and the food spawner, I went back to Blender. The fan would be a little bit more of a challenge than the standard meshes that I had previously made before. I wanted the fan to have rotating blades, so I had to make sure that the fans had the correct values for its x-axis, or else the rotation point in the Unreal Engine wouldn't work. Luckily for me, I already knew this going in, so creating this mesh wasn't really that much of a problem for me. After I got the models the way I wanted, I brought them into Unreal Engine and I really think they look pretty decent and add a lot to the setting and environment. To me, it feels a little less static now. I definitely want to try and implement smaller things like this into the game just for setting's sake. Well guys, that's going to be it for this SkyBurger Devlog. I hope you enjoyed watching the progress that I've been able to make on the game, and if you did, or if you have any suggestions or anything like that, please leave a comment down below. If you want to see more SkyBurger news and development progress on the game, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. This really helps me out a lot guys, so if you enjoyed the video, be sure to do that and give me that feedback. Thank you guys for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next video, which I swear won't be another year. Later.